The Greyjoy Rebellion, Iron Islands, Orgmont, an eagle soared in the grey cloud-covered sky, releasing a high-pitched cry as it changed directions. The sun did not shine that day, humid air permeated Orgmont. A rough and hardy island among the several similar islands that made up the Iron Islands, the home of the Ironborn. A raiding people that raped and pillaged as part of their culture, as a way of life. The sea appeared disturbed, erratic and strong waves brushed against the sandy shores of Orgmont. A strange type of tension hung in the air, war was taking place at this very moment. A war the Ironborn were losing, and quite badly at that. The fleet sent for Lannisport had been reduced to nothing but planks of wood floating about the Fair Isles after they'd been caught in a pincer attack. The rest of the fleet had also been completely decimated. Much to the displeasure and disagreement of House Blacktyde and a few others, they had attacked Seaguard on the orders of Balon Greyjoy, the king of the Iron Islands. The results were what Edric Blacktyde, the head of House Blacktyde, had already predicted and warned against. Attacking a bastion built solely for defense against an attack from the sea when they were already stretched thin was never going to work. The attacking fleet was utterly ruined. If that wasn't enough then, just as they had declared their rebellion, Robert Baratheon, ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, king of the Andals and the First Men, and the protector of the realms, was quick to rally his subjects and make his way towards them in haste. And again, as had been expected, the lords of the Seven Kingdoms, or 6 excluding the Iron Islands, were quick to respond to his call, their morale already on an all-time high from the victory against the Mad King some years ago. Things did not look good at all. Now they would fight for the Iron Islands as a result of foolish attacks. On the shores of Orgmont, thousands of men stood in rows, certainly not neat rows but rows nonetheless. They looked rough and rude. The Ironborn had always been a strangely rowdy people. They stood silently, looking at the horizon, cold sweat dripping down the backs of some, their grips on their weaponry tightening. Axes, swords, spears, bows, there was no order to their weapons, no grouping, no organization, each one picking what they were best with. The Ironborn were not built for hard and fast tactics, they would much rather simply brute force their way through everything. Perhaps that was why they faced this problem. At the head of this army stood a tall man with a broad stature, short white hair that had been tied to the back. He wore no armor, only a pair of roughly knit pants, the matching armors worn by the men, with a kraken drawn at the center. The crest of House Greyjoy was nowhere on his body, it lay bent and broken on the sand beneath him. A cloth was tied around his waist, presumably his own shirt, and he stood there with both his hands resting on an impressive jagged battle-axe. Lord Edric Blacktyde stood his ground with a solemn expression, his eyes displaying a mixture of anger and frustration. He only had himself to blame for lack of decisiveness. But he'd not bend the knee. They'd lost but he would not surrender. The shame of living on after kneeling to man was too much for the Ironborn Lord, one would say, an Ironborn Lord resembling the olden days. The days of the Horde, masters of much of the Seven Kingdoms. A young man ran up to him, sweat rolling down his forehead. "My lord, the Greyjoy have taken to fortifying Pike." Edric looked at him in silence. This too was well within expectations. "This is ships on the horizon." His words were cut off by a nearby shout, but he was anything but angry. Pushing the boy to the side, he walked forward, grabbing his axe in one hand as he walked into the water, staring off into the distance with a scrutinizing gaze. There, he saw dozens if not hundreds of ships sailing across the dark sea. The waves of the ocean coalesced under his steps, as if moving to set a path for the Lord Blacktyde. Gritting his teeth in frustration, Edric's grip tightened on the axe, the wood cracked under his monstrous strength. It may not be well known to anyone but Ironborn, but the young lord of House Blacktyde had a reputation for both his strength and his temper, as well as his outlandish attitude towards things that still managed to ignite a fire in those under his command. He was one of the greatest sailors the Ironborn had ever seen, as well one of the richest. His raids were a sight to behold for all those not actively taking part in them. Not that any would actually give up the chance to do so. Edric walked back to his original position, his steps producing audible thuds. Thought that may have been because of the sheer tense silence that had currently taken over all present there. He ran a gaze over his men, his people, and then silently once more took to watching the sea. It had been difficult at the start, but he found solace and ease in living with the Ironborn. They fit his personality well. Being a noble certainly helped, and he found himself enjoying the occasional raid as well. They were his people, and the Greyjoy would have them die in vain, a cowardly and idiotic house. The fault lied with him too. However, he had obeyed his father's words, and the words of his father before him, showed his loyalty to them, and in return, they'd abandoned them. Orgmont was strategic. They could have made a good stand here, if only the Greyjoy didn't lock themselves up at Pike and take the majority of their forces with them. Shaking his head out of such thoughts, the Blacktyde smiled, the smile slowly transforming into a vicious grin as ships holding the flags of House Baratheon, House Stark, House Tyrell as well as other major houses and those under them slowly drew near and near. He stomped his foot on the ground, and raised his axe. Before smashing it into the armor that lay at his feet. "They abandoned us, men." His shout was heard clearly, echoing across the army of Ironborn that stood behind him, under his command. They tensed up, surprised by their commander's actions. In truth, most of the men that stood here did so not because Balon Greyjoy had ordered them, they did because Lord Edric of House Blacktyde had obeyed that command. They knew him to be a fearsome man, one famous for just how much he had raided, and they respected him for it. That alone would have sufficed for the might-respecting Ironborn, but the man was one who drank and ate with them, lived with them, cheered with them and cried with them. The Ironborn were a simple people. Such a man had moved those that met him quite a bit. Edric smashed his axe down once more, completely ruining the crest on it. "I reject their claim over the throne. Fuck the Greyjoy." In response to his heated words, the men stayed silent, not quite knowing exactly what it was that they were to do. "We are Ironborn, born on the Iron Islands. We're not like the mainlander boys, we're not like the cowardly Greyjoy either. We're going to stand right here. Protect this shore." He once more rested his axe on the ground, resting his own two hands atop it right after. "But not because they ordered us to. We protect this shore because we are Ironborn. This is our land, it's our people that will die. It's our children that will be forced to adapt to the shitty ways of the stags and the wolves and the fucking roses. Bloody roses. What kind of fucking Ironborn yields to a rose?" The Ironborn behind him fidgeted in place, their hearts beating faster, a strange rush washing over their very being as they listened to the words of the man commanding them. Old way, he told me. What old way? Balon Greyjoy raises our children to be sniveling backstabbers and cowards. That's not Ironborn, that's not even fucking mainlander. If that's what we're going to become, then we deserve to die right here, right now. The sea raged, the calm waves from before turned into higher ones, crashing into the shore, water splashing against Edric who stood with a fierce expression on his face. The Ironborn who witnessed this were wide-eyed in complete shock. The sea moved to this man's rage. They believed in the drowned god, a deity of the sea represented their god's will. And the sea agreed with Edric. "But, it's true that we'll lose. We'll probably die here, but I say, so what? We may die here but we'll die Ironborn. We'll die, men, scheming and plotting as one for the women and the bratty lords of the mainland." He stomped his foot on the ground. "We die here, we die today. But we die Ironborn. We do not yield, we do not bend, for we are Ironborn." He veritably roared, lifting an axe built to wield with two hands with one, and following his shout, many more followed. The Ironborn stomped the ground, their expressions turned ferocious and serious. In their last moments, they would follow Lord Edric of House Blacktyde. The Ironborn that would never yield. A true Ironborn. Thunderous roars were the only things noticeable on Orgmont that day. XXX. Some distance off the Iron Islands. Countless ships sailed over the sea, holding tens of thousands of fully armored men, standing with stern faces, their hands on their weapons and their gazes fixed on the islands in the distance. They were motivated. This rebellion was an opportunity to obtain great glory for their efforts in the war and be recognized. As for their victory, no one doubted it. The bulk of the Ironborn forces lay at the bottom of the sea after the previous battles. At the head of this majestic fleet sailed a massive flagship, bearing the symbol of House Baratheon, a stag. On this ship stood a tall, bulky and well-built man with long pitch-black unruly hair, a similarly long beard. A crown rested atop his head, making it more than obvious who he was. If that wasn't enough, then there was the iconic warhammer resting over his shoulder and the stag on his metal armor. He put a hand on the ship's sides, looking off into the distance with an expectant gaze. Robert Baratheon, ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, king of the Andals, the first men and the Rhoynar, and the protector of the realm. One many would call the mightiest man in the Seven Kingdoms. Just behind him stood a firm, well-built man, with his arms folded behind his back, a strange, rather bland expression on his face. Black hair, a short-trimmed beard, a sword at his waist, the head of House Stark and the Warden of the North, Eddard Stark. The other men on the ship were busy with making sure it did keep sailing and getting ready for combat. King Robert and Eddard Ned Stark were old childhood friends, and the king much preferred his company to some posh lord that would be licking his boots if he so ordered. Strangely enough, the ship quaked and the king somewhat stumbled before laughing loudly, banging his hand on his own armor. You think their god is trying to help them? The king laughed at his own joke. Still, this is strange. Ned Stark looked at the raging waves that had been calm and serene not moments ago. He chalked it up to pure coincidence. Weather was a fickle thing after all. Still though, there was this sneaking suspicion in the back of his mind. Would you look at that? Robert pointed to the shores of one of the 3 islands in sight with a small grin on his face. The whole shore was filled with men who seemed to be shouting something as they banged on their weapons. Robert, no. Ned shook his head. Going there would be a change to the invasion plan. They had to head for Pike. Fine. Robert Baratheon sighed at his friend's boorish words. There would be a battle at Pike too, but what harm was there in going to that island first? Though, Ned rubbed his chin and thought, if those men were left on that island, their own forces could be caught in a pincer attack once they besieged Pike. That would not be good. Thinking quickly, he ordered for a sizable part of the fleet to change directions and head for the island of Orgmont. Their orders were to capture or kill all enemy combatants. XXX. The part of the fleet that detached there and then bore the flags of House Redwyn, the Lord Admiral and the Master of Ships, Paxter Redwyn led this fleet. Already having gained honor and glory when he aided Stannis Baratheon in crushing the Iron Fleet in this very war. Understandably, the Redwyn fleet, 200 warships strong, had great morale, and the Lord Paxter himself was also somewhat expectant. The rewards for protecting the flank of the king's fleet would by no means be small. Standing on the forefront of his flagship, his heartbeat picked up. The Lord Redivne, despite his age, was excited. Still, however, nothing could have prepared him or his men for what came next. As they drew nearer, the herd shouting and metal banging, the noise shaking up their very beings, the sea raged harder, large waves threatened to throw the ships off balance. Land! Make for land, quickly! And then, the fearsome shouting which had only resembled the roar of an animal turned into something understandable. The words they heard then were not cheers of the name Greyjoy. They were, what in th? Blacktyde, 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 Blacktyde. 29 comments 0 vote. Battle for Orgmont, Iron Islands. Orgmont. Paxter Redwyn looked at the shouting men with surprise and shock evident in his eyes, even as his ships shook under the twisting and turning sea. This was by no means his first encounter with the Ironborn, but it was the first encounter that looked anything similar to this. He'd made the assault at the Iron Fleet led by Euron and Victarion Greyjoy, but those men were not like this at all. Still, however, Paxter too had seen his fair share of battle. He was no child and he had seen before what war brought. Knock arrows, knock. Hearing the shouts, the men of the Redwyn fleet were quick to respond. Even as the sea raged and shook threatening to them all overboard, they all obeyed their lord. Arrows were pulled from their quivers and set up. Draw. Paxter Redwyn, Lord of the Arbor, sworn bannerman of House Tyrell, and good brother to the Tyrell Lord, Mace Tyrell, raised one hand, putting the other at the hilt of his blade. Draw. Bows were drawn, pointed at the countless Ironborn present below them, at the shore. The ships shook once more, throwing some soldiers off. However, they too were quick to regain their bearings. The Lord Blacktyde, standing at the forefront, both hands resting on his battle-axe, understood just what they were about to do. Shields up, men! His voice was heard loud and clear. The Ironborn obeyed, putting up their shields, even those that did not quite understand just what was coming. Some moved forward, wishing to cover Edric Blacktyde, only to be stopped with a gesture. Edric raised his hand and shook his head, only eyeing Paxter Redwyn with a stern yet vicious gaze. He was possibly doing something many would view as idiotic, but in the eyes of the Ironborn, it was nothing but an act of bravery. The young Lord Blacktyde stood at the beach solemnly, even as loose, loose, and then, for a moment, the grey sky was blotted out by fiery steel. In the next instant, those very same dots came raining down on the Ironborn forces. Hot burning steel arrows rained down on wooden and metal shields. Naturally, men died. There were those hid in places not covered by their shields. This was no fantasy story with flowers as far as the eyes could see. Pained groans, screams of the injured and the thuds of dead lifeless bodies were heard all across the battlefield. As for Edric himself, the man stood tall, an arrow firmly held in his hand. Many more lay around him, some floated in the water, and those that saw what had happened would be questioning reality for a long time to come. This is impossible. Paxter Redwyn's eyes widened in astute disbelief. When those arrows sought to make the young lord a corpse, a wave had crashed against the Blacktyde, throwing all arrows that would have hit him to the ocean. What is dead may never die. Edric looked to the boy standing near him, an apprehensive glint in his eyes. What is dead may never die. Cheers and roars rung out behind him, metal banged against metal, a loud and primitive orchestra of stomps, one that struck the Southern Lord's soldiers deeply. They had never seen something like this. The Ironborn gathered here were men who had seen battle throughout their lives. That was the way of the Ironborn. From the day they could walk, these men worked on and with ships, looting, raping and pillaging as was their divine right. Land. Make for land. Paxter Redwyn once more shouted orders. They could shoot them down from right there, but such was not the way of honor, of lords and knights. They would meet them on the ground. Not strike them like cowards hiding behind behemoths of wood and iron. Warships made their way to the shore and it became blatantly obvious that they meant to crash ashore. Edric grasped a spear from one of the men standing near him. Then, fuck the mainlanders. With a shout, he pulled back his arm, veins popping out on his bare skin. The spear was thrown, flying across the air in a moment that appeared to be utter silence. And then, it crashed into the man standing right beside Paxter Redwyn himself, startling him and making him stumble forward. Using the sides of the ship as support to stay upright, Paxter looked at the maw. No, he looked at the corpse lying a few meters behind him. The spear had gone through the man's armor and chest, throwing him across the deck as if some animal had rammed straight into him. Before he could do much in the way of reacting, the ships shook and quaked once more, crashing ashore as they kicked up wet sand all around. In the name of the king. March. Paxter pulled out his sword, raising it to the sky with a serious face. March to victory. Victory. The individual commanders under him followed suit, declaring their victory long before the battle truly took off. Why would they not? This was an assured victory. There was no speech, no inspirational words, no promises of glory or riches, but it was enough. More than enough. Mighty stomps of armored boots made for their songs of war. The ships shook again, but this time under the vigor of the men on them. This would be enough, but it was not the way of House Redwyn to be so short and boorish. Loud booms of beating drums soon accompanied the stomping. Victory. Ladders were thrown overboard and soon men started climbing down by the hundreds, full plate armor carrying the crest of the great House Tyrell, golden roses. Much to the surprise of their commanders, however, for all their rage, the Ironborn did not take one step forward, as if they were waiting for something. Lines were formed, shield walls with pikes protruding to the front. The fleet was an experienced one. They would not waste the opportunity they'd been given by the fools. Cold seawater brushed past their knees and yet they stood firm. And then, the shirtless white-haired Ironborn standing at the forefront, one that was no doubt commanding all these men, picked up a battle-axe many would have difficulty even lifting with one hand, and slowly, he took firm steps forward. Edric Blacktyde, a name that would be remembered for a long time to come. The slow steps soon changed into a jog and then into a full-blown run as he raised his axe. Death. With that one word, all hell broke loose. Death. The Ironborn ran behind the Blacktyde, brandishing their weapons with vicious expressions. Death. Edric once more roared. Death. And then with a mighty push, he crashed into the line of soldiers. Ah! Standing at the deck of his ship, Paxter Redwyn finally understood why they were so heated. These men didn't intend on surviving this confrontation. Like a tidal wave against a fishing boat, a wave of Ironborn crashed into the shield walls. Not to say the Ironborn suffered no casualties, the initial crash into the lines had resulted in a number of them simply ending up impaled on the protruding lances and pikes. Still, however, Edric crashing into the line had clearly done a good deal of damage. The man had just quite literally thrown back the men at the front, their shields bent under the force. To the ships, even amidst the chaos, the pained and dying screams of countless men that lay at the ground, dyeing the clear seawater a bloody red, Edric had not yet thrown all to the wind. He shouted orders to his men, swinging about his axe. Walking forward, he stepped to the side, avoiding a spear, and pulled on it, smashing his own axe into the attacker's face as he impaled another behind him with the very same spear. They didn't have ships at the moment, all had been lost at the previous battles, but a vicious grin formed on the Blacktyde's face. They would simply take the ships they needed from these lot. Board the ships. Cold sweat ran down the forehead of Paxter Redwyn as he looked at the battle ensuing below. It was a fact that they had been fooled into a disadvantageous attack. Making for land was a folly attempt. The men that landed were by no means their full numbers and were greatly outnumbered by the Ironborn already on the beach. Though, shockingly, the shield wall had been broken down by the commander of the enemy forces, quite literally crashing into it. Loose arrows. Quickly, he hurriedly shouted orders, looking down at the battle. His men were falling one after the other. They'd underestimated the capabilities of their commander. Use the shields these cunts dropped. In response to Paxter's words, Edric shouted out orders of his own, picking up a shield from the dead soldier laying at his feet. The man had an axe lodged in his shoulder, he wouldn't be needing it. Take up the shields. The orders were relayed throughout his men by shouts. The vanguard of the Red One had been completely and utterly ruined. The fact that the literal commanding officer was the one at the literal front had done a great deal in raising the morale of the Ironborn. Steel arrows once again blotted out the sky, but this time, the casualties were far lesser than before. Edric raised the shield over his head, staring at Paxter with a grin, even as arrows rained and men died all around him. Look at these backstabbing fuckers. This is what Balin wanted us to be. Edric scowled, spitting on the ground as he ran forward. Many of the Ironborn agreed with his words then and there. Why, you might ask. The volley of arrows had killed more of the Red One than they had the Ironborn. The injured men at the ground and those with their backs turned to the ships were laid to an eternal sleep by their own who had fired, not caring if they would survive. And then, the one thing that would make this battle one for the ages happened. Edric kicked a knight rushing at him in the chest. The hit had been so hard that the armor buckled under it and the man himself was thrown back several feet. He then ducked just as a sword passed overhead, and grabbing one from the ground, he turned around, driving it through the head of his attacker in one swift movement. This was not important, however. After all, Edric had one hand on the ladder of the Red One flagship that had run ashore. Share thoughts. 32 comments, 0 vote. A decisive battle. Iron Islands. Orgmont. The battle for Orgmont, for rulership over the Iron Islands, was fully underway now. Men died left and right, the sky was blotted out by burning steel and corpses littered the island's beach. The Ironborn forces moved with overwhelming momentum, killing men left and right. Lord Paxter Redwyn, standing at the deck of his ship, observed the ensuing battle with slight uneasiness welling up in his heart. Perhaps they had been a little too confident when landing. Unmounted knights were going to be at a great disadvantage against people who were used to fighting battles on their own 2 feet. But then again, after the overwhelming victory and complete decimation of the Iron Fleet at their own hands, the Redwyn fleet possessed great confidence. It had been folly, but it was understandable. Steel clashed with steel. Pained groans and cheering roars filled the battlefield. The Ironborn followed their one leader with great vigor. How could they not? After such words and such actions, what man could ever hope to stop himself from charging blindly? They were sailors who were taught to fight from the day they could hold a weapon, and now they followed the one man leading this charge. Knights fell and so did Ironborn, but it became blatantly obvious that landing on wet sand was a move that was tactically unfit and idiotic. All across the battlefield, scenes of gore and brutality, like an Ironborn beheading a knight or cutting off another's limb before getting impaled through the back with spears, became common sights. And then, something that would prove decisive in determining the victor of this battle happened within the span of a few seconds. Lord Edric Blacktyde had grabbed onto one of the numerous ladders that hung from the moored Redwyn ships. The Ironborn were undefeated in the sea. There was no command to draw or loose. Soldiers fired arrows at the Blacktyde one after the other. Only none of those arrows seemed to hit their mark. The ones that rained down from above were blocked with a shield he himself held, same with the ones that came from behind. The ones from below were blocked by the men following below him on the ladders, at the cost of their own lives even. The Ironborn would not let him die. And then, within moments, the Ironborn lord jumped aboard a ship, looking around sharply as soldiers and knights hurried around him, building up a wall of shields in hopes that he may be felled before they lost their lives. Paxter Redwyn ran to the side of his own ship, his eyes wide in shock as the Ironborn once more cheered, raising their weapons to the sky for all to bear witness. This can't be. Why is a lord at the head of an army? Paxter shouted out in defiance. Yes, it raised their morale, but if he died, the Ironborn would break and fall. Edric Blacktyde was a fool in the eyes of the Lord of the Arbor. Edric ran at the shield wall with both hands on his axe, clearly not afraid of anything that might come his way. With a mighty heave, he crashed into the wall once more, sending several behind it tumbling across the wooden deck. Spinning the axe around, he smashed it down on the head of a knight with finer armor than most he could see, splitting the man's skull. No, the whole body fell in 2 halves, and yet, in a display of both might and skill, The Blacktyde spun it before it hit the deck and swung upwards, turning the head of a nearby soldier into naught but a red mush of blood and flesh. He was as fast as he was mighty, crashing into the shield of one to his right while swinging his weapon in an arc, cutting down many a man with a single strike. By now, some of the other Ironborn had begun climbing other warships. The knights and soldiers of the Arbor did their best to defend the mighty beasts of wood they prided themselves on, but soon found themselves outmanned and outskilled. The people they thought benign savages fought with vigor and motivation that left them shocked and astounded. Thus the battle proceeded greatly in the favor of the seafaring people. After all, what is dead may never die. They had been abandoned and had not much to lose anymore, apart from the lord that fought at the very front of battle. Facing its brunt with green eyes burning in fury. Arrows struck the Lord Blacktyde in his chest yet did nothing to impede his storm-like onslaught. Wounds from swords and spears slowly accumulated. He was a man after all. Yet, even through that, in the eyes of both friend and foe, the Ironborn lord killed with a vicious grin on his face. And then and there, even the southern lords admitted. He was mighty. Soon the Ironborn had begun to jump over ships, felling lords, soldiers and knights alike. A moderate crew would stay behind with each ship rid of its former crew while the others took to the ones ahead, using ropes and planks to board them and kill their crews. Volleys of burning arrows were fired one after the other, knights slammed their shields on the deck forming mobile fortresses of iron and steel all as they roared and cheered. Glory to the king, glory! They would not run, they would not turn their backs. They were the great Redwyn fleet. One of the greatest fleets in the Seven Kingdoms. We've beaten them before, we'll do it again. The order and discipline they had was something the rather primitive Ironborn were not privy to. But, in this one instance, it proved to be a quality to be admired. What were shield walls when men jumped over and above them? What were spears and pikes when they were broken and snapped? What were knights who fought formally? What were arrows if the men they were shot at charged regardless? Edric himself seemed to be moving in a straight line for the restless Lord Paxter himself. Throwing aside men, pushing them to the roaring and raging sea of blood below if need be, cutting down those that proved problematic. Where he passed, mutilated corpses and traumatized survivors remained. And then, in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours, thousands of men lay dead, dying or too injured to continue. A fleet of more than 100 warships had lost to men that stood on a beach. Credit was clearly due to the one who had led them to such a victory. Aboard the central flagship, Lord Edric of House Blacktyde stood and stared solemnly at Lord Paxter of House Redwyn. The Ironborn lord stood on his feet, a battle axe in his hands, and the Lord of the Arbor rode a horse, a lance in his hand and a sword at his waist. Strange as it was, such was custom for some southern lords. I thank you for bringing me ships. Stay your tongue, Lord Blacktyde. At this Edric chuckled, then laughed, stroking his rather short beard with an amused expression. You've lost. Paxter's expression turned rageful for a moment, but Edric's gaze too turned serious. Look around you, throw down your weapon. Save your people at least. 26 comments 0 vote. A quick death. Iron Islands. Orgmont. Paxter Redwyn ran a gaze around himself, seeing nothing but death and rage all around. The proud knights of the Reach lay dead, bent and broken, under the feet of heathens and raging barbaric men who knew naught but slaughter, pillage and rape. Their cheers as they jumped across ships, slaughtering many men, were only jarring to the Lord of the Arbor. He turned his gaze to Edric, who had dropped his battle-axe now and only stood there with a small smile etched on his face. The Lord Blacktyde knew full well that this battle was already done and over with, and was now observing his own wounds, running a hand across his blood-smeared chest. So, my lord, Redwyn, what's your decision? His words held a slight bit of ridicule. Edric would be fine either way after all. Even if the man did not surrender, it would hardly be to his detriment. Paxter scowled, pulling on the reins of his horse while at the same time raising his incredibly large lance, calling it a polearm would fit better. There was just one thing this Ironborn had overlooked in his arrogance: the momentum and the vitality of his men was in no small credit to himself. As Paxter saw it, if he were to die, the Ironborn under his command would break down and become easy pickings. I see. Edric Blacktyde smiled, clearly pleased with the development, leaning down to pick up one of the many spears laid throughout the deck, among corpses of some finely dressed knights, perhaps smaller lords. There were few things in this world better than witnessing one of the mainland lords fall off their high horses as the hubris of their self-appointed greatness collapsed around them. He spun the spear around a few times, walking about the deck, all the time observing Paxter Redivne. And then, with a slight cry, Lord Redwyn charged at the Lord Blacktyde, his head lowered as he positioned the polearm straight for his opponent's heart. The next moment, the spear was thrown, swishing through the air at insane speeds before piercing Paxter's armor as if it had never been there. The lord was thrown off his horse, flying through the air for a good few seconds and then, with a thud, he crashed down, gasping for air as he clawed at his armor, his eyes wide in shock and disbelief with blood welling up his throat as he choked and coughed. The horse grew fearful and averted course, the beast of nature knew when to back off. The same could not be said for its master. Edric Blacktyde raised a hand to the air. "Well, look at that, lads. We fucked 'em up." He laughed heartily, ignoring the pain from the numerous wounds he had accumulated throughout the battle. All around, Ironborn cheered loudly and audibly, shouting about how mainlanders were too big of pussies to actually be able to beat them on equal grounds as they raised their weapons to the skies. They had won this. As the commander fell, so did the morale of the Redwyne forces, and what remained after the initial onslaught became easy pickings for the vicious Ironborn who now fought with renewed vigor. It did a number to see their own lord kill the other one. To say that it had been a victory born solely of their desire and morale, however, would be somewhat wrong. Lord Paxter Redwyne had indeed been right about one thing. As mighty as the Ironborn were, this battle would have had a greatly different outcome if not for the presence of the Blacktyde Lord. And, most importantly, while not many would know, it was also not a victory born of blind charges. The decision to board ships had been imperative in securing this insane victory. The Ironborn were not smart, they were not one for precise tactics and thought-out war maneuvers, but even they could tell, this was a victory they to a great extent owed to Edric Blacktyde. And then, it started. One of the many Ironborn there raised his foot and stomped it down on the wooden corpse-littered deck of one of the Redwyne ships. Another followed in his steps, then another, and another. If the drumming of the Redwyne was a sound worth noting and of great majesty, then what echoed across the battlefield now could only be described as grandiose. Metal boots met with wooden floors and booms followed. The Ironborn stomped in silence, paying their respects to the Lord Blacktyde, and then, they all cheered. As before, those of the Redwyne that survived were once more left with shocked eyes and gaping mouths. There was no cheer of Greyjoy. In its place, there was only Blacktyde, 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 Blacktyde. XXX. Under the grey cloudy sky and above the raging dark sea, rough and hardy men could be seen boarding mighty beasts of wood and iron with excited and expectant gazes. Each held varying weapons, bows, swords, spears, axes, whatever they fancied. Their armor was only chest plates, shoulder, elbow and knee paddings with warm clothes much similar to coats worn over them. Their gazes fierce, they hungered for battle, they longed to fight under the man that led them now. When their king and his king too had abandoned them all, he'd lead them to victory against a seemingly hopeless foe. They believed in the drowned god, a deity of the sea that expressed his own will and moved through the sea. Seeing the sea turn from calm to raging along with the Lord Blacktyde made a deep impression on the, some might say, obsessively religious Ironborn. But then again, their religion was mostly rape, pillage, slaughter and sacrifice. Currently aboard the largest of the ships in the now Ironborn fleet, that same Blacktyde sat atop a crate on the deck with a somewhat thoughtful expression on his face. Some men stood near him, while others were far too busy manning their new fleet. "Captain, we can go for the Reach or Westerlands, maybe even the north with the mainlanders away to Pike." A man with a short beard and a bald head suggested calmly. The Greyjoy had left them to die here anyway, so it was only right to leave them to die as well. "No," Edric answered simply and shortly. The man could only nod his head in acceptance. He'd be damned if he disobeyed him. The eyes of Edric himself were fixed on the corpse of Paxter Redwyne. He'd ordered for all others to be thrown to the sea, both Ironborn and mainlander. But it wasn't out of being calculating, or something. It was because the Ironborn didn't believe in burials or cremations. Being thrown to the sea was the only burial an Ironborn would ever need. Edric touched his chest. A total of 5 arrows were sticking out of him at the moment, but his men didn't dare to call that out, what with him appearing completely unbothered by their presence. Not to mention the numerous other wounds on his figure. Clicking his tongue, the Blacktyde gestured with his hand. "Bring me a torch and check the hull, these pompous cunts should have some good drinks somewhere." One of the younger Ironborn was quick to obey his command, running off and returning with a torch within a matter of moments. The Ironborn around him observed in awe and admiration, not uttering a single word as Edric pulled out the arrows one after the other, using the burning hot flames to burn the wound close with gritted teeth. Cauterization like this was by no means safe, but the arrows hampered his mobility. The wounds themselves were bearable for now. One might wonder why he was concerned with mobility. The fighting was over after all, wasn't it? The answer to that was, no. It was far from over. Handing the torch back to the boy, Edric stood up and walked to the forefront. Men, women, Ironborn, this war is far from over. The Greyjoy may have abandoned us all, but we sail for Pike. This is our land. We're not cowards that are going to give it up just to save our own hides. He shouted out orders with his arms behind his back. His army paused whatever they were up to listen and obey if need be. And hearing his words, they agreed wholeheartedly. They would not be like the cowardly Greyjoy that hid behind tall walls, leaving the rest of their home to burn. No, they were going to do as they'd done for thousands of years. The world would fear the Ironborn reavers. Their agreement was voiced by the banging of metal against wood once more. At the same time, the sea raged and roared, waves rose high, and while this would scare any other man, it only served to spur the Ironborn on. Edric smiled, pleased with his people. He was not ashamed of their ways, nor did he reject them. They were his people, he would bleed for them if need be. How many did we lose? He asked with his back turned to his crew, only observing the horizon with an emotionless face. If not for the high waves, it may have been possible to see the siege of Pike from Orgmont's shores. For 6,000 of the mainlanders, we lost 1,000, my lord. One of the crew reported dutifully. They had somewhat outnumbered the enemy, only by 2,000 though. What is dead may never die. Edric closed his eyes in respect. For those that had fallen following him, they had died for their homeland, and perhaps that was what they desired. He could only hope so. My lord, what is dead may never die. Some among the Ironborn understood that Lord Blacktyde was a somewhat passionate man. Well, let's prepare a little surprise for the mainlanders. Edric turned around with a grin plastered on his face, his eyes fixed on the corpses of Lord Paxter Redwyn and several other lords piled up in one of the corners. A few hours later, a fleet of over 100 warships, man-made beasts of war, sailed out of Orgmont, filled to the brim with armed Ironborn, and at the head of this fleet, aboard the visibly larger flagship, a man with short white hair and a beard of the same size and color, stood with a serious expression on his face, his hands behind his back and an expectant glint in his green eyes. XXX. Iron Islands. Pike. The island of Pike was something of a capital for the Iron Islands, and the majestic castle erected there was the seat of Ironborn kings. It was a sparsely populated island with little to no fertile soil and only short grass accompanied by uneven land and strange rock formations. Currently, however, this dead island was anything but dead. Thousands of tents had been erected across the fields, and men in suits of iron marched here and there, flying different banners, representing whichever house they were from. The tents too, to some degree, seemed to show which house was occupying them. The gigantic stone castle that had been erected atop a mountain stood tall and proud. A trench had been dug out around one side while the other was just a steep fall. Taking this heavily manned castle was proving to be a highly difficult task. It did consist of several high-rising stone structures erected atop land formations isolated from the main landmass, with only bridges connecting them after all. Robert Baratheon stood outside the castle, fully armored. The mighty king appeared akin to beast with his horned helmet and large warhammer, a stag branded on his chest plate. Many men of similar colors stood behind him, as did many with other colors. The force present on this island was by no means small, but it was all but irrelevant, seeing the small bridge which only allowed a minuscule amount of man passage at any given time. This, however, was at the moment not important at all, for now at least. At one of the beaches of Pike, a man with the sigil of House Glover, silver mailed fist on scarlet, observed the sea with an apprehensive flint in his eyes. Lord Galbart, head of House Glover, let out a small relieved sigh seeing the Redwyn fleet make its way to Pike. They needed all the men they could get. With that, he turned around to leave, only to be stopped by the horrified gasp of an Ambrose soldier. This did confuse him. House Ambrose was a banner of House Tyrell. Didn't those southerner cunts pride themselves on bravery? What is it, boy? He asked with a slightly annoyed expression. It was no secret that northerners didn't like southerners. My lord. The boy frantically pointed to the ships, stuttering with a pale face. Galbart turned around once more, curious about what could throw a man into such panic and fear, only for his eyes to widen in astute shock and disbelief. By the gods! There, atop the ships that soared over high tidal waves, splashing about water, the men standing were not the Redwyn. No, the armor made it more than apparent who they were. But that was not what scared the boy so, not by any means. It would only serve to enrage him. Many of those that came from the Reach, as well as those that believed in the Seven, let out fearful noises, paling in sheer horror at the grisly spectacle visible even from there. Lord Paxter Redwyn, as well as several lords that had accompanied him before, hung from the hulls, hanging from flaming seven-pointed stars, their insides hanging freely from slit stomachs inside which the heads had been shoved. Someone, whoever it was spitting in the face of the seven. Of course, while Galbart was quick to leave seeing Ironborn manning the ships, the Reach men were far too shocked and horrified to even move, even as the ships came closer, ran ashore and a shout echoed. Ironborn, with me, how could they have expected something of such horror? Such defiance. Join the Discord server at web links. 30 comments 0 vote. An uphill battle. Iron Islands. Pike. Galbart Glover pulled the reins of his horse, his long brown hair flowed in the winds as he ran a gaze over what was below. A stern expression, a serious outlook and hundreds if not thousands of Northmen behind him. The Northern Lord was confident that he would win this little battle, or he should have been at least. Cold sweat trickled down the man's forehead, the slow wind brushing past the uncovered parts of his skin didn't do much to help. He could spot some 50 or so ships beaching, no, they were running ashore, crucified bodies up front. Although, this didn't enrage the Northern Lord. It may as well have been a pleasant surprise, the faith of the Seven was something loath for the Northerners. The Reach troops still at the beach had not yet moved, one may think them brave but Galbart and his fellow Northern Lords knew better. Those cowards were rooted on the ground like trees, to them this may have well been a herald of the end. Instead of being enraged, they were shivering in their iron boots at seeing their gods defiled. Southerners were really stupid cunts. And then, under his watchful eye, a powerful voice ordered, no roared, the deathly silence that had taken over all men there only served to add to its intensity. Ironborn, with me, show these mainlander fucks how to fight. Lord Glover knew better than most that this was not just bravado. The Ironborn were among the best warriors on Plaintoes, it did not help that every man, woman, child and elderly knew to fight, taught to do so from when they were but babes. However, what he did next was something that came right after. A man, bloody and injured, was the first to jump down to land. A spear in one hand, he swiftly beheaded a Reach soldier standing nearby with another. Turning to look up at them with a grin plastered on his rough yet strangely attractive face. In response, the Northern Lord too grinned back at him. After all, which man would not welcome a worthwhile fight with open arms? His brother by blood, Robert Glover stood to his side, another trusted aide to the other. They welcomed this fight, though, if there was one thing they found advantageous yet disappointing, was that they outnumbered the Ironborn forces in sight by quite a lot. Galbart's gaze unintentionally went to the tall giant of a man standing some distance to the side, wearing armor heavy enough to bash a man with. The Clegane was here as a representative of House Lannister. Though, a significant number of Lannister soldiers were also present with each of the forces. What with the Lannisport raid and how, a Lannister always repays his debts. The Glover smiled widely. Well, this would be one more battle to record. XXX. Edric stared up at the riders standing over one of the ridges with a confident grin, his grip on the two weapons he held slightly tightening. The crucifixion, while a way to show his stance towards gods other than his own, had also been something of a battle tactic. Looking at the unmoving men at the beach, it appeared that it had more than worked. Numerous Ironborn came down the ship, taking advantage of the confusion among the Reachmen to either behead or cut down the fair-skinned soldiers that faced them. Each kill was something to be appreciated, these people did look down on them a lot after all. Edric stabbed the sword in his hand into the ground and once more turned his gaze to the riders. He had less men than he would like, but it was an unavoidable consequence. While he may have killed off the Redwyn fleet sent his way, he had many injured under his command. Too injured to continue fighting even if they so desired. Lord Blacktyde would not let them do so. They had fought fiercely yet recklessly, that was the price to pay. A significant part of his forces was back at Orgmont, sailing back to Blacktyde Island with the rest of the ships. Pick up their pikes and spears. He shouted out orders quickly, seeing the lords back off the ridge, clearly preparing to attack. The Ironborn obeyed his orders, some brought forth the spears they had taken from their previous battle while others picked up ones from the men they'd just put to death. Form up, Edric shouted again. The Ironborn only answered with confused looks, not quite understanding what he was saying. Form a line, you stupid cunts. Put up those spears. Drop the shields. When the horses get near, stab them through the necks. The Blacktyde explained with a smile on his face, amused by how they quickly ran to obey his orders. He liked the Ironborn, they were rather simple people. With the sea behind them, the Ironborn formed a wall of spears at the beach, a good few archers behind the first line so that they might shoot down as many as possible. The rough and hardy people would go down fighting right here. It's been good sailing with you lot. But we're gonna bloody die here. Edric shouted with a grin plastered on his face. The Blacktyde Lord was clearly not afraid. One might say he was looking forward to it. None dare to though. What man looks forward to death? You said that last time too, my lord. One of the Ironborn replied with a smile of his own, his hands and feet moving restlessly, his gaze fixed on the men forming up some distance to the front. I guess I did. Edric Blacktyde put his spear to front, one hand resting on a steel sword lodged in the sand. XXX. At the castle of Pike, the outer walls had fallen and some of Balon Greyjoy's sons had died in the conflict. None of that was important at the moment however, a deathly silence overtook the entire landscape. The forces of King Robert Baratheon made preparations to rush into the tall architectural marvel the Ironborn called the seat of their king. While not numerous, the king's forces greatly outnumbered the Greyjoy. The whole force had been divided into many regiments after all, one for each of the islands making up the Iron Islands. Sure, the main force had been completely decimated, but the Ironborn people as a whole were a force. Holding them off was a great necessity if this was to succeed. And then, the one thing that would decide this battle happened. Thoros of Myr, a young man from Volantis, a priest of the god of light, walked up to the bridge, stumbling the whole way, reeking of alcohol and all kinds of drinks. He wiped his brown mustache and beard, loosely placing a hand on the hilt of his metal blade. With loose steps and shaking arms, he drew the sword, almost falling to the side as he pointed it at the stone structure standing tall right ahead. Thoros ran a hand over the blade and, under the watchful eyes of hundreds of men, of lords, of kings and commoners alike, the sword caught fire, and with burning sword in hand, rahhhhhh. The priest charged past the bridge, shouting and waving his sword like a madman as he ran and ran. All gathered there froze all but for a moment, and, after him, they stormed the bridge after Thoros of Myr. The Ironborn stationed at the castle looked at him as if he were some god among men, recoiling in abject fear. True to the dismay of Lord Edric Blacktyde, the rule of Balon Greyjoy had made them weak and fearful. XXX. Thundering steps and stomps echoed across the beach, large horses of all colors ran down a hill, rode by men in suits of armor, wielding swords and polearms. Their roars were the only things that accompanied the booms of their mighty mounts. Ready. Edric braced for impact, as did many with him. They were not many but they did not falter. They did not fear. They would die but they did not bend. For they were Ironborn. And just as those mighty and high knights in suits of armor, each a hero of their own books, followed and loved by men and women alike reached them. Now, the Blacktyde Lord roared to his fellow men. Spears were raised and shields were splintered. The mighty mounts were pierced through their very heads by spears their own masters saw built. The beasts roared and raged, as if dissatisfied with their fates, even as they lost their lives. Of course there were exceptions. In some places the lines were breached, men crushed under hooves. However, their companions were quick to avenge them. If not those at the very front of the line, then those just behind speared the horses right through their skulls. Edric himself was among those that had succeeded first. He yanked the beast aside and pulled out the spear, stabbing it into the neck of the knight that rode the creature right after. The one just behind was clearly thrown off by what had happened. Seeing their companions thrown off their mounts, the second line of knights could do naught but pull on the beasts they rode, bringing them to a quick and disordered halt lest they stomp over their friends and brothers in arms. What is dead may never die. Edric shouted with his spear raised, stabbing a knight that halted through his chest as Ironborn and their enemies alike died around him. We are mighty, we are unbroken, we are Ironborn and we will never abandon our ways. He quickly climbed up the horse of the man he'd just murdered, and turned his spear towards his own, banging on his bare chest even as fresh blood seeped from the many wounds on his body. And the fuck are these lot gonna do about it? He spun around the same spear and pierced through the head of a man around him, then in a display of sheer raw strength, the body of the dead man was swung around to block any weapons headed towards himself and smashed into any approaching. The Ironborn reavers cheered and roared, greatly motivated by both his words and his actions, fighting like madmen. Caution and care was thrown to the wind. The sea people died by the tens but they took many with them as well. Steel clashed with steel and with flesh, the smell of blood and guts permeated the beachcombe battlefield. Men fought and men died. The waves of water under them ran red from the blood. At the same time, seeing a bloody man roar in defiance made the knights and soldiers feel unrest deep in their very beings. Something of this level, they'd never seen it before. Outnumbered 2-1, the Ironborn fought and fought. Grah, motherfucker. Of course all would not go Edric's way today. The Blacktyde was thrown off the horse he'd just climbed by a man standing on the ground, his head the same level as a horse. A bloody mountain. Edric chuckled, clutching his heart. He had just been punched in the chest after all. At the same time, however, steel blotted out the gray skies. Join the Discord server at web links. 37 comments 0 vote. A mountain. Iron Islands. Pike. Wet sand splashed under the hooves of horses. A charge of knights was a fearsome thing. A thing to behold as a thing one would hope to never be on the receiving end of her. With their polearms and swords, these masters of combat could kill many a man, bones would shatter, shields would be splintered, severed heads would fly and hearts would be crushed. It didn't help much that they were veterans of war, a war that had taken place not 6 years ago. A bloody war which saw a new king sit atop the Iron Throne, a new king of the Seven Kingdoms. In any other case, the Ironborn would be in great trouble. A small regiment of knights was a threat, being outnumbered by a mixture of knights and soldiers was far worse. But well, it was not all so lost. The Ironborn that had heeded the call of Edric Blacktyde did not fear death, they were ready to embrace it with open arms and cheers. Shields down, spears up. When you get the chance, pile up the bodies of horses and men. Form a wall. Lord Blacktyde had also proven himself to be no stranger to warfare, coming up with new ways to dial down the onslaught as he stood up, having earlier been thrown to the ground by a veritable armored giant. Edric gripped his spear tightly, using it as support all the while staring into the eyes of his opponent. There was no flash of fear, no hint of caution and no madness. All this time, the Ironborn Lord had actually been moving with something in mind instead of blind charges. Behind them, the tide rose and bodies floated. The Ironborn who had followed him now knew that it was not simply a series of coincidences, there was something more to the sea reacting and aiding their lord. This, however, did not serve to make them suspicious of him, instead, it only drove them into more of a frenzy. The knights and lords found his strategies bizarre and disgusting. To pile up the bodies of man and beast just so they would not gallop over them was not honorable at all. Had he no respect for the dead at all? Kill anyone that comes over it. Edric shouted loudly, now grinning widely as he spun the iron spear in his hands, turning to his unmoving opponent. A moment of utter silence, even as the battle raged around them, and then, contrary to what the mountain expected, Edric threw the spear at his face. The Clegane moved his head to the side, ever so slightly, avoiding what could have been death just in time for Edric to rahh. The Ironborn Lord rammed him, smashing into his body like a hammer unto steel. Gregor Clegane. The rumors ain't just empty words. Edric's eyes were wide, a bit of blood trickling down his lips, even though it went completely unnoticed. The man was by now covered with wounds from many weapons. It wasn't like he hadn't been hit or he wasn't in pain. He was simply forging through. Why? Edric Blacktyde refused to go down. Gregor Clegane, much to his own shock as well, stumbled back a few steps under the hit, the great sword in his hands almost falling to the ground as his grip loosened. Many others witnessed this and many more were taken aback. They'd never in their dreams even thought to witness the mighty mountain be pushed back. Edric Blacktyde only wielded a sword now, a sword shorter than the standard one and somewhat thinner as well. Spinning it a bit, he sneered at the mountain, making the man roar in rage and rushed at him. Metal clanked under his heavy footsteps and clear marks were left on the ground. Throwing caution to the wind, Gregor Clegane madly charged for Edric. Of course, the Blacktyde had known his personality beforehand and was expecting this. His size wasn't smaller by much, but it was enough of a difference for him to make movements that allowed narrow dodges of the mountain's greatsword. It would be folly to meet the man on equal grounds. He was a monster of nature. Come now, that can't be all. Edric raised a hand, a clenched fist, perhaps ordering something. The Ironborn near him reacting certainly seemed to imply so. A knight from the north, seeing an opportunity, brandished his lance and pulled on the reins of his massive horse. The beast howled in response, kicking away the man near it before charging straight ahead. A lance was lowered, aimed for Edric Blacktyde. Only, it would never reach its destination. Just a few meters away from the Ironborn Lord, a spear pierced through the horse's skull, followed by one puncturing its legs. Ha ha ha. Retards. The Ironborn responsible for it laughed at the knight. The man had after all fallen face first into the sand. XXX. Iron Islands. Pike. At the seat of House Greyjoy, the ruling lords of the Iron Islands and all that inhabited them, the battle had taken a turn for the worse. After the charge of Thoros of Myr, the forces of King Robert Baratheon had taken to the bastion by storm. Breaching door after door, gate after gate, the Ironborn stationed there had already been fearful after seeing the flaming sword wielded by the priest and seeing men slaughtered like sheep did not to help their morale. All the while, Balon Greyjoy had hunkered in his throne room, the massive doors reinforced, the fiercest of the Ironborn warriors, as Balon would have it at least stationed all around the place. Where the hell is the Blacktyde brat? He raged, throwing the cup in his hands to the cold hard ground. The Greyjoy had a beard, long graying hair that reached his shoulders and a slight stutter in his step. Even then though, he did have the traditional armor on, a sword at his waist even if it may as well have been wasted upon him. Since his ascension to the throne, Balon had not seen much combat. "My king, Lord Blacktyde, makes his stand at Orgmont," one of the soldiers near him reported dutifully, bowing with closed eyes. None dared to comment on how unsightly the king looked at the moment. They knew they'd lose their heads if they dared to after all. And why isn't he here? He had a duty to his people. He had a duty to his king. Balon Greyjoy was not pleased, he was not pleased at all. This would let the brat gather influence, whether the war was lost or won, it would be he who sat atop the throne. Someone like Edric was unneeded and unnecessary, he was far too fit as a leader. It didn't help the king's suspicions that the Ironborn didn't believe in hereditary rule. The Ironborn around him stood silent, not quite sure what they were to do in such a situation. Balon grumbled, it appeared that not allowing him to lead the attacks on Lannisport and Seaguard wouldn't be doing much in the way of stunting his growing influence. Though, he didn't have much time to ponder upon these thoughts seeing as the massive doors to the throne room started quaking and shaking, as if something was striking them. XXX. Iron Islands. Pike, Edric Blacktyde, was still fighting the mountain. The latter proved to be a fearsome adversary. "Fucking go down already you lug." The Blacktyde shouted with a bloody grin, some part of his left forearm hung loosely, bone visible underneath the red flesh. Gregor Clegane hulked towards him, great difficult in his steps, blood flowed freely from his knees, the armor and mail over them nowhere in sight. It was more than obvious that he'd been struck there innumerable times. A steel dagger was stuck in his shoulder, just below the neck. Both fought slowly, painfully yet ragefully. It was a grisly spectacle. To the point where some around them had stopped fighting, only watching the battle with wide eyes. It would after all decide if Robert Baratheon was the victor here or not. If the Blacktyde died, the Ironborn ranks would crumble. Though, the piles of corpses were proving to be a gruesome yet viable tactic. The horses could no longer gallop over them. Climbing over them on foot just got the men's spears through their heads. Balon Greyjoy was no commander, nor were any other Ironborn lords. They fought with an each man for himself mentality, so Edric Blacktyde's actions had thrown them for a loop and disoriented their strategy, which had previously just been to stampede over them. Edric Blacktyde rushed at Gregor Clegane. The sword he'd been using previously had now been replaced by an axe. He stepped to the side, avoiding a mighty downward slash and made a swing of his own, a horizontal one aiming for the mountain's neck. "Though, you madman," Edric laughed, backing away from his opponent. The mountain had used his own shoulder to block the hit going for his neck. Except, it also appeared that the Blacktyde had made a miscalculation. Gregor had more than enough reach now, and in a feat of insane strength, he swung the greatsword upwards. Steel cut through flesh and blood sprayed. Edric's chest had a gash going upwards and only a quick reaction prevented his skull from being parted. It did, however, leave a cut going from his chin up to his head, cutting through one of his eyes. The Blacktyde groaned in pain, wincing as he stumbled back. Men around him grimaced, even some of the knights. That wasn't something that could be healed. At the same time, a horn sounded and cry rang out. "Balon Greyjoy has bent the knee. It's our victory." The shout fell upon the ears of men like thunder. Moments passed in silence before the knights and soldiers started cheering, raising either fist or weapon to the sky, a testament to their victory and a way to celebrate. "Motherphew!" Edric Blacktyde roared in rage, or he was about to at least. Losing his balance, the Blacktyde lord stumbled forward instead. "Stop those two!" Galbart Glover, who had arrived some time ago, curious about the fight, ordered sternly and then turned to the Ironborn. "Take your lord and sail back to Blacktyde. He may live yet." His helmet in his hands, the Northern Lord's command surprised many, however, not the Northerners. The war was over and they no longer had a reason to be enemies. The North also had a deep-rooted hate for the Seven Gods. Edric had made a joke of them and was a fearsome commander. Of course the smarter thing to do would be to put him to death. But honor dictated that they no longer could. It would be attacking an injured man. Well, Galbard's gaze was fixed on the Ironborn. Much to his displeasure, they listened to him. Grabbing the roaring and raging Edric Blacktyde, dragging him back to the ships without listening to his own protests. Tisk. If they'd not listened and kept fighting, he could have wiped them all out right here. Lord Glover rode away with an unpleasant expression on his face. He had hoped they'd not heed his words and continue with their bloodshed. It surely would have been a glorious thing to fell the man who'd gravely injured the mountain. Gregor Clegane tried to run after Edric but fell facefirst to the ground. His knees had been slashed apart and one of his arms wouldn't work again. The savage had cut one of the shoulder tendons. The mountain wouldn't be fighting again. He may have even been crippled for life. But oh well, the Northern Lord didn't give two shits about that. Fuck the Lannisters. House Lannister didn't have the best of reputations among the Northmen. Here's the Discord server, web links. 41 comments 0 vote. To be continued.